Again, I wanted to thank the Commission for inviting me and to share some thoughts about lines today, and also to the commissioners who are spending a lot of time and effort on a really important problem and a really important set of issues. And I appreciate you all doing that. I'm Charles Stewart, Professor of Political Science at MIT and one of the co-directors of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project. And as part of that, what I've been trying to do over the last several years is try to help move election administration in an area that pays more attention to metrics and measurables, and trying to manage by the same sorts of kind of management techniques and measurables that we find in other areas of public administration, like education and corrections and traffic and all the rest. One example of that is working with the Pew Charitable Trust and their Elections Performance Index, which I've actually worked with some of the commissioners as well on that project. But today we're talking about lines. With Steve, I have a white paper as well that will be on the website and shared with the Commission. I wanted to, I guess, make 4 points in talking about lines, lines waiting to vote, and say a few words about the costs of lines, of long lines, make the point that lines are not universal, that they vary geographically and demographically. Also make an observation that there are a lot of proposals out there to reform the problem of lines, make them shorter or more manageable. There's a way of kind of organizing them within the theory of queuing. And then along the way, keep noting that not only are metrics oftentimes not brought into this discussion, but even research on best practices and what's effective is missing, and that would be an important thing moving ahead to try to get goosed along. So just in terms of what are some of the costs of lines and how we think about them. I proposed in the white paper 3 ways of thinking about the cost of lines. And one is by trying to estimate the number of people who turn away and don't vote in an election because of long lines. And here we can also introduce 3 major public opinion surveys. One that Steve has already mentioned, the Voting and Registration Supplement done by the Census Bureau. There's 2 others. This is a Cooperative Congressional Election Study, the CCES, which Steve is the principal investigator on, and the Survey of the Performance of American Elections, which I'm the principal investigator on. These are 2 very large national surveys that cover election administration issues. All of these surveys together come up with the same kind of order of magnitude estimate from 2012 about how many people didn't vote in this last election because of long lines. In order of magnitude, it's roughly 500,000 to 700,000 people. Which, again, to put things into context, we heard earlier that this is smaller than the problem with voter registration. It's roughly the same size, though a little smaller than the problem we experienced a decade ago with the antiquated voting machines, hanging chad and all of that. So it's a little smaller than some of the other big high-profile issues, but I still would argue it's in the same ballpark. So we lose votes because of long lines. We also lose confidence because of long lines, and I provide evidence about how to see that. We can ask people how confident they were that their vote was counted as intended, and we see, for instance, that people who wait more than an hour to vote are significantly less likely to say that they were confident their vote was counted as cast than those who wait less than 10 minutes to vote. This is from the SPAE. But it's not only that they lose confidence in their own vote, but we also see that when you ask them about confidence that votes in the county were counted as cast, if they wait a long time, that's lower. If they ask them how confident they are that the votes were counted in their state level, at the national level, it goes down. And it's not only based on personal experience, but if you live in a state where lines are long, but you yourself waited in a short line, this is the last table, you're also going to be less confident that votes were counted as cast. So there are knock-on effects, too, with long lines that undermine the confidence that people have in elections. And then finally, there's the monetary matter. I wouldn't emphasize this too much, but given that election administration is public administration, we do want to put at least cost in some sort of perspective. I tried to do a quick calculation about how much time is spent waiting to vote. And here's my calculation. That's supposed to be a multiplication sign there. But if we take 13.1 minutes, which is the average to vote in 2012, times the number of people who voted in person this last election, we have 23 million hours waiting to vote in the last election. And at $23.67, the average hourly wage, that's about $500 million of economic time waiting to vote. Now, I wouldn't risk my tenure on this estimate, but I would point out that, for instance, in 2000, the Voting Technology Project was able to estimate that in an election year, local election officials spend roughly $1 billion running elections. So again, the amount of time that voters spend waiting is within the ballpark about what we observe local government spending running elections. It's just that the voters are spending it one voter at a time, distributed across 130 million people, and budgets are, of course, much more aggregated. We can also talk, so those are some thoughts about the costs of long lines. There are some kind of basic facts, demographic and geographic, that I think need to be thrown out there. Nate personally threw those out last at your organizing meeting, and I don't want to dwell too much on them. Just to, again, to repeat that in 2012, as in 2008, actually waiting in line a long time was unusual. Most people more or less waltz right in, vote, and waltz right out. But there is between, say in 2012, 4% of voters who waited more than an hour. And we can see the average wait times there on the tables. But if you wait more than an hour, you wait a really long time. And so we follow up with people who say they wait more than an hour. Exactly how long did you wait? And they're waiting on average 2 hours. Okay, so if you get caught in that long line that's an hour long, it's going to be a long line. And that tells us probably something about what's happening in those precincts. That's also where a third of all the total wait time is happening. This is a small group that's waiting more than an hour. We can talk about the geography of waiting. Again, you all know this. Vermont is the champion in terms of short wait times. Florida is at the other end. Largely, there are small states that have short times, and bigger, more urbanized states have longer times. I'd also point out, for instance, that California is one of the short states. Short waiting time states. California has historically long ballots and lots of diverse populations and many of the same problems that happen in the larger states. And so I think we might learn some things from California maybe. Another way of looking at the geography is through a map, and I apologize to Commissioner Thomas for making Michigan look real ugly up there. It just sort of looks like a blob. But basically, there are patterns as well where kind of the southeast of the United States, the seaboard, is where the longest lines are, and the west is where the shortest lines are. This tells me, from what we know about policy diffusion, that there may be commonalities regionally in the United States in terms of policies and laws that lead to variations in lines. There's also variations within states, of course. I shared this map with the Florida supervisors a couple of weeks ago. Here's a map that shows the variation even within the state of Florida. The counties that aren't colored, by the way, have too few respondents to get averages, but you'll notice that there's a fair amount of diversity within the state of Florida. Many of the urbanized states, the darkest states, urbanized counties, have the longest lines. That's not a surprise. But I'll point out, by the way, that Pinellas County, which has St. Petersburg, has among the shortest lines among the larger counties. And so again, if you're a large urbanized county with a big city, you aren't preordained to have long lines, even in the state of Florida. Finally, there's variation within counties, and I have this map, and I have a longer analysis in the paper, in part to do a shout out to Supervisor Snipes, who was here earlier, who actually publishes anticipated wait times on her website. Here are where her 17 early voting centers were. We had one that had an average of 14 minutes anticipated wait for the early voted period. That was the Supervisor of Elections office. We had another library, the Tamarack Library, 157 minutes on average. And then we had all the other local early voting centers. So there's a lot of variation even within counties, even within precincts, which has been noted. Finally, I will end on geography by just noting that there's a lot of persistence in the lines. This plot shows the average wait time in 2012 at the state level against the average wait time in 2008. And you'll notice with the diagonal showing us the states where it was longer or shorter in 2012. And you'll notice that there are some states where it was longer, some where it was shorter in 2012, but the overall pattern is there are some states that just seem to be persistently long, some states that are persistently short. Maybe there are short-term marginal one-off things that affect how long things will be, the lines will be, but there are some persistent practices in the states as well that this suggests we need to understand. There's a matter of demography. Again, the average period of voting, 18 minutes in early voting, 12 minutes in election day voting. The racial differences have been mentioned before. African Americans are waiting roughly twice as long as whites are waiting. It's clear from the survey evidence that this isn't, and the statistical analysis on it, that this isn't discrimination against individual voters. If we do statistical analysis where we begin to take into account the demographics of where people live, and I'll just put this graphic up and I'll just talk about what it means, is that as we basically, as we drill down into where people live, and this will be consistent with some of the testimony here this afternoon, it's not so much that individual minority voters are being discriminated against, it's that the places where minority voters tend to vote have long lines. So in those areas, even white voters wait a long time. So the issue really is, why is it that the precincts where African American and Hispanic voters vote, what are the difficulties that attend those precincts? I'm sure we can talk about some hypotheses there. Finally, I want to just say a few words about proposals about what to do about long lines. I don't have strong recommendations to be had. I do want to suggest to the Commission there are ways of thinking about and organizing these proposals within the theory of queuing, which some of you have encountered before, some of you more often than others, where we have, it's the science of understanding customers arriving, waiting in line, taking a service, and leaving. Of course, running a polling place involves 3 queues, where one feeds the other, so it's actually quite a complex situation. Because we have to check in, we have to mark ballots, and we have to submit ballots. And each of those can be not only places where lines can form, but you can also have downstream effects of all this queuing. So that, if you have a line to scan the ballots, it can actually propagate back into people checking in. So queuing theory gives us 3 types of prescriptions. We can reduce the number of voters coming to a polling place. We can increase the number of service contacts, or we can reduce the average transaction times. And so these various proposals, which I put up here, can be kind of lumped into all of these larger categories. And we can make, some comments about, these proposals and whether empirically, that is from what we observe right now from the data that we have, whether these, whether kind of the hypothesis is confirmed that these things will make lines shorter. And here are just a few things to kind of throw out there. So for instance, we could increase vote by mail, and we can increase early in-person voting. Well, actually, it turns out empirically, if we look at the data from 2008 and 2012, the places that did more vote by mail in 2012 actually ended up having longer lines in 2012. So there's something happening in those states. My guess is that also resources are being redistributed as well, so that the remaining in-person voters aren't relying on a greater density of resources. They're probably getting by with fewer resources. Making Election Day a holiday is a popular one for a lot of reasons, and one perhaps for giving people the day off, so maybe they would smooth out their arrival times. There's mixed evidence about that. In terms of increasing the number of service points, we've talked about this earlier today, we can increase all sorts of resources. The empirical trend has been the opposite, as the states have consolidated precincts, reduced the number of poll workers, et cetera, over the last several years, largely in response to budgetary cuts. DREs, electronic machines, seem to take longer to vote on. There's a tendency to abandon DREs for other reasons, so that might be something that redounds to the favor of voting times. And then finally, we can reduce average transaction times, and I will note that there are some recent research that suggests a kind of robust relationship between ballot lengths and waiting times, to the point that each item in this research, each item on the ballot, so this will be like one more office, et cetera, adds between 8 and 12 seconds of time waiting to vote. So, and so when you see that there's variation between 30 and 50 items on a ballot in a county, you can just do the math really quickly and figure out what that does to wait times. So I'll just conclude with a couple of things, and I guess in the interest of time, I'll just say one thing in conclusion. 10 years ago, when Steve and I got involved in doing a lot of this research, the hot topic was voting machines. And when we hopped into the voting machine controversy and problem, there ended up being a magic bullet, which was retiring antiquated machines. And we could demonstrate that straight out with the data. That bullet does not exist for long lines. We cannot go and say, based on the evidence we have, if you were to double the number of poll workers or give everybody electronic poll books, it would cut lines by 10 minutes. We don't have the evidence for that. And so I guess one of the things that the commission, I hope we can talk about is how it is that we foster a system in which not only is there continuous improvement, but also the generation of the type of data and type of information necessary to allow policymakers at all levels of government, from the federal all the way down to the local governments, to understand what some of those magic bullets might be. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. And as the baton got passed very quickly from Professor Ansel of the Hair to Professor Stewart, who introduced himself fundamentally, I did want to emphasize he is really a cutting-edge scholar in this whole area of applying hard data analysis and metrics to the question of how we're performing on elections. And I understand there'll be a book in the not-too-distant future of yours coming out that I think will be path-breaking in that respect.